One of the great features we have in QBOT V3 within pattern quilting is the ability to knock out inner boundaries or inner areas on the quilt. So where this would be helpful is when you're doing quilting around an applique or quilting around something inside a block, for instance, that you don't want to quilt into. You want to do something else inside that area later, but you want to have an overall quilting in the background space. And what you can do is, if you have a design that's a block design of, say, stippling or micro stippling, you can select your outer boundaries, then select your inner boundary that you want to stipple around, then pull in that design, and QBOT will automatically knock out the center portion or knock out the inner boundary portion that you've selected. Also, we can select multiple inner boundaries. And that can come in really handy if you have a quilt, for instance, that has some blocks, and I'm going to show this in an example. I'm going to do two examples in the video. In the first example, we're going to quilt around an applique, and then in the second example, I have an edge-to-edge design that I'm going to place in, an edge-to-edge meander, but I'm going to knock out around some blocks that are just plain blocks of fabric, because later I want to quilt in a block design in those spaces. So let's get started with the applique first. On my frame right now, I'll zoom out and you can see I've got this kind of a neat little seasonal wall hanging, and as I just kind of go around the quilt here, you can see I've got some ants that are carting off some watermelon and in a field of blue. So I want to do some quilting in that field that mimics maybe clouds or something like that, and it lends itself to the meander design. So let's get started with that. I'm going to go into pattern quilting, and the first thing that I do is I select the outer boundary. Just set my points along the outer boundary. And this procedure is the same for any kind of pattern quilting that you do. You select your outer boundary points. I'm being precise in my boundary because I want to, I don't want to overstep this in my meander. I don't want to go beyond the boundary, especially since right around that field of blue, what I've got is a piece of black border. It's a very narrow border, and if I go into that, it's going to look kind of strange if I quilt into that. I want to do something in that area a little bit later just to finish it off, but I definitely don't want my meander to go into that space. So I've selected my outer boundary, I press done, and now we have the dialog box that asks, do you want to set an inner boundary shape? And we do. We want to set an inner boundary shape. So we press go on that, or yes on that, and I'm going to make a precise selection around this applique. So this will take me some time, but I want to be precise. I'm going to just go off maybe a 1/16 of an inch around and outside the applique. But I'm going to take my time and I'm going to choose this very, very precisely. Okay, so I'm done choosing the points around that boundary, and it took quite a while to do it, and in fact I've got 240 boundary points. Now maybe your applique or what you're selecting, or the points you select around your inner boundary, maybe you don't need that many points, but with QBOT V3 we have the capability to do any number of points to define the boundary properly. So I'm going to press done, and it asks me, do you want to set another inner boundary shape? Well, for the purposes here, we only have this one applique, so I don't need to set any other inner boundary points. So I will say no. And you can see it shows that boundary quite nicely on the screen. Well, now I want to put in my edge-to-edge pattern, which is GTEE 0010. So I scroll down here and I'll find that. And it puts it in at the horizontal orientation, which normally if you're doing an edge-to-edge, that might be fine, but we need to modify that. So I'm going to modify it, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees clockwise. And I'm going to pinch it down and just make it right to the size, just like that. And I'm going to make sure that I don't go beyond the boundaries at all, just like that. And maybe just a slightly smaller, just slightly smaller. And I'll nudge it just a bit, just like that. And you'll see right down here on the left-hand side of the screen, right above the Done button, we have a checkbox that says Use Jump Stitches. In this particular case, I'm not going to use jump stitches. I'm going to do it as a continuous line. So as it hits the boundary, that inner boundary, it's going to just follow the inner boundary until it picks up the quilt design again. That's the way I want to do it on this particular example. On the next example, we'll use the jump stitches. So I say Done. And I also, at this point, want to save the pattern. So I'm going to save the pattern, and I'm going to call this Appliqué background. And say OK. So I saved that. So that'll be important if something happens or communication's interrupted, the power goes out, I can get back to that particular perfect size. All right, so we're ready to quilt. So all I need to do now is press Move to Start. I'll pull up my bobbin thread. Just like so. Okay, got my bobbin thread going, get my scissors ready, and then I press go. And there it's going around the boundary of the applique. You can really count on the precision of the QBOT V3 to get this done right and without any fear of going outside the boundary for sure. Now, of course, you make sure your setup is correct and you have your drive wire tension properly tensioned and all of your parameters correct, but if you have that set up properly, the QBOT is really phenomenal in getting it correct. As we go around this applique, there's really no room for any kind of error, and it's doing a great job. All right, so we've done the first row. Just lock off my stitches there at the end. and pull up my bobbin thread and trim it. And now we're ready to do the next row. Now, what's kind of nice about this particular design is it's a nesting edge-to-edge design, which we've put vertically, and we're going to nest it, and we're going to march along the quilt here, or the wall hanging. We're going to march across it in a horizontal fashion rather than doing a vertical fashion. So all we have to do now is we press overlay, and if you look at the screen, the original points that were cut out reappear, and that's because we saved the seed file that we used originally, so we can regrow the seed when we do a modify and then overlay. So now we're going to modify it, and I'm going to double tap the Y direction because I know that this particular design is not a offset nesting design. It's a standard linear, only one direction nesting design. And I'm going to use my finger and just drag this across like so. And I look at it, and that's the correct nesting for it. And it all looks good, and I press done. It processes the inner boundary and knocks it out, and then we're ready to do the second row. So move to start. And press go. You can see how it's going along this boundary, and it's going to pick up the design and make sure that it nests properly, even in this little interior section. We'll pull up our bobbin thread. Snip it. Now we do, again, the sequence is overlay, modify. So we overlay, modify, and I'll double tap the Y again. And then I shift this design over so that it properly nests with the previous row. And that looks good. And I'll say done. Automatically trims it, and we'll move to the start point. Now there's a pretty big gap in this particular one and the previous row that we sewed. There was a big gap in the stitching. So, but it really doesn't matter. QBOT figures it out, and we'll go around the boundary without any problem. And then we'll trim this off. And we're ready for the next row. So now we, again, overlay, modify. So here we go, overlay, modify. I'll double tap the Y so we don't move it in that direction. I bring it to the point where I like the nesting. And then I say Done. Move to start. And then go. Okay, so we're ready to pull up our bobbin stitches again, or a bobbin thread, I should say. Pull up that bobbin thread, trim, overlay, modify, double tap the Y again, and I'll just move that over by hand. Just like so. And then we'll press done and move to start. And go. Okay, we're almost done with this project here. So I pull up my bobbin threads, clip them again, overlay, modify. I'll double tap the Y again, move this over. That looks good. And you notice on the right hand boundary, if I let that quilt, it's going to quilt off the quilt. So I need to turn my trim on. So I press that button, turn the trim on, and I tap right because I'm trimming on the right hand side. I say OK, and then done. And it trims right to that right hand side. So all I need to do now is press move to start. Now, as this quilts, I'm going to be very careful about that right-hand boundary because it is trimming to the right-hand side, which is the extreme right-hand side, and it may, because I only set a couple points going down that side, it may try to go over into my outer border, that little tiny strip of black that I have on my quilt, the outer border, and I'm quilting with blue thread. So if I need to, I'm going to move the quilt with my hands just to make sure it doesn't go into that area. So that's okay to do that. As it's getting close and you see it heading toward, out of bounds a little bit, it's really, QBOT's not going out of bounds, it's just that it's, as things have eased in and as fabric moves a little bit, we just want to be careful. We only get really one shot at doing this if we don't want to rip things out later, which I don't really want to do. So I'm going to press go, and I'm going to watch it like a hawk as it gets to that boundary, and if I need to, I'll shift the fabric in or out to make sure it doesn't go off into the blue. And I'm working the fabric just a little bit to make sure that it doesn't go off into that blue area. I mean, go off into the black area. Okay, so there we go. So looking back at the screen now, you can see what QBOT has quilted, and on the fabric it looks great as well. So I hope you use this feature. It's, you know, the choosing inner boundaries when you need to go around things like applique or other blocks. In the next example, we'll do an edge-to-edge design where we have knocked out blocks along the width, and then we'll put in designs in those blocks. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to undo the quilt that's on the frame now and get it prepared. So the next time you see me, we'll have the other quilt up on the frame. All right, I'm back. And we have this crib size quilt on the frame right now. And this particular quilt design is kind of nice, or the patchwork design is kind of nice, because it lends itself to have some edge to edge mixed in with some block quilting. But the way the patchwork is done, it wouldn't be clear on how to do the edge to edge or the block quilting. But with V3, pattern quilting, and using the inner boundary feature to knock out the areas where we have open blocks, it will come together seamlessly. So let's take a look at it through the needle cam. What I've got here is I've got these wide open blocks here. They're about 5 inches square, and they're separated by patchwork. So a couple of squares here, a smaller square, and a couple of squares. And if you went through this quilt top and tried to do each of those blocks or a couple of blocks at a time with a block design, it would look over quilted, I think. So we're going to use pattern quilting and the inner boundary feature. We're going to lay down an edge-to-edge design, but we're going to use jump stitches this time so that we don't have any kind of overstitching around the blocks as we quilt across it. Now it'll take a little bit more time, but it'll work out nicely. I'm also going to turn on my tie-off stitches so that I don't have to worry about those loose threads at the end. So let's just get right on into it. I'm going to go into pattern quilting, and we'll set some outer boundary points. And I've now, just to finish the setup on how this quilt is laid out, I've placed the quilt, my backing, my batting, and my quilt top, and I've based it around the exposed edge of the quilt. So both the left edge and the right edge have a basting stitch, as well as the top edge. So I don't have to worry about my hopping foot getting under there, and I can quilt off the quilt just a little bit. Okay, so I want to be clear on that, so we don't have users that get that foot caught up underneath the edges and then cause a big problem. So I'm going to choose my points. I'm just going to choose just a little outside of the boundary, just so I go off the edge in all edges. And down my edge. And across the bottom. And come back up the left-hand side and finish off the whole thing. Okay, there's my outer boundary. That is done. Now if we look at the screen, do you want to set an inner boundary? Yes, we do. So now I'm going to be a little bit more precise with setting my inner boundary. I'll put my needle down a little bit, and I'm not going to go right up against the boundary. I'll go about 1/16 of an inch away from it. So I say yes, and now I'm going to set some points. So there. And I'm staying again about 1/16 of an inch away from my boundary. You can see that in the needle cam. And I'll go up this outer edge. Okay, So I've set my first boundary. Do you want to set another inner boundary shape? Yes, I do. So I'll go to the next block and I'll select some points around it. And I'm going to do this for each of the remaining two blocks. All right, so I'm at my last block that I'm going to knock out, and I'm going to say, actually I'm not at the last block. I'm going to say done, and then yes, I do need to set some more inner boundary shapes because I have some blocks that are further down, the second row of blocks, and my throat space in my machine will probably allow me to do at least 3 rows of quilting. So I'm going to take advantage of that and set my last boundary. And here I've set my last one, and I'm going to say no now. I don't want to set any other boundaries. So I say no. And I found a design online at Intelligent Quilting by Crystal Smith, or Crystal Smythe. And it's called Berry Special Holly. So I'm going to use that design because it complements the fabric that I've got in here. And so I'll go into my Berry Special Holly folder, and I'll select that design. Now it comes in relatively large, so I need to modify that. And it looks like this would be kind of the height of the blocks. So I kind of like that sizing and that density for the other space. Okay, so I'll move that up and we'll chain this together. I'll keep chaining until I get the length that I like. One more time maybe. That's good. Then I'll move that over and up just a bit so that the density of the quilting looks good. So I'm going to say that that's what I would like. I'm going to use jump stitches, and I'm going to trim it to the left, right, and top boundaries. And I'll say OK. And then done. And there it's all trimmed, and you can see that there's going to be a lot of jump stitches in this. And instead of letting it, instead of trimming those threads between each one, each line segment or multi-segment part, I'm going to let the thread stay continuous, and then I will trim them afterwards once the quilt's off. So, so we'll get it started, and then we'll see how it goes, okay? Pull up my bobbin thread and press go. And then I continue. And press go. Continue. And press go. You can see how tedious using jump stitches can be. However, after it's all said and done, you won't have the stitched segments in between where the jumps are. And depending on the quilt and depending on the backing and so forth, it might be way more beneficial to use these jump stitches. In other cases where you can guarantee that those extra lines would be kind of hidden in the pattern of a fabric, or you won't see the back of the quilt, you may just want to let it go and stitch those straight line segments. But to show the capability of QBOT V3 and what the jump stitches do, this is a good example of that. And even though it's a little bit tedious, the end product will look really nice. Okay, row 1 complete. And I will be honest with you, that was pretty tedious to have to set that stitch after every segment, although I think the results really pay off. It looks great on here, it really does. So, looking back at the screen, now we have to do the next row. So just like in the first example, we do an overlay and then a modify. And as you can see on the screen, as soon as I pressed overlay, the design reappeared. Now we do another modify. This is one of those designs that nests just by pulling it straight down. So I'm going to double tap the X or the Delta X field, and I'm just going to pull it straight down. And I'll keep nudging it just a little bit more. It's almost there. There, just like that. That looks good. So now I say yes, use jump stitches, and I will trim the left and right. Say OK. And then I'm satisfied with everything. I made sure that I checked that jump stitch box, and then I say done. It processes the inner boundary, and then it processes the trim, and now we're ready to quilt. And again, this is going to be very tedious, but it'll be worth it in the end. I say move to start point, and we're going to quilt this second row. Okay, so I've finished the quilt top doing the background fill. Basically, that's what we did. We did that edge to edge, we chained it, trimmed it, knocked out the inner boundaries, and then I filled the background. And when it came time to advance the row, I fit in the quilt design the subsequent time by choosing, as part of my outer boundary, choosing discrete points that of the design as it quilted out in the previous row, and that helped me do the alignment. And then I just moved it down advanced it downward, and then it automatically trimmed to the inner boundaries and I trimmed to the outer boundaries, and I finished the quilt. Now, to be honest with you, when I did it with jump stitches, it was a very tedious process. And it was tedious because that particular design created something like 48 or 50 jump stitches. So, and some of the stitching paths were only maybe a ½ inch long. So as it was close to the boundaries, it would do just a half of one of the little holly berries and then stop. So what I did was I did an extra rotation of the machine. I did a up down of the needle to help set that point, relieved the tension in the thread, and then I just pressed continue, and then it advanced and created a true long jump stitch. I didn't cut the stitches at each interval and then pull up my bobbin thread. But in the end, it's worth it. So what I would say is on small projects, depending on really depends on your background fabric and your background or bobbin thread. If it blends in really well, you may want to use jump stitches. You may want to use, just let it continuously do the path, and you'll end up with it stitching out those jump stitches, and it creates a nice little boundary around the thing you're knocking out. That's what we did in the applique first project. If you have something that contrasts, so you have a very contrasting thread compared to your backing, you may want to use the jump stitches, because depending on the complexity of the design, there could be lots of backstitching, and you end up with this really heavy look on the back of the quilt. Not so much on the front of the quilt, because if it's kind of hidden in the ditch, you don't notice it so much, but it really does show up on the back of the quilt. So now since I've done the background fill on this particular quilt, I've rolled it all the way forward, and now I've rolled it back to the beginning, and I'm going to quilt out the block designs. And the way I'm going to do that on this quilt, because all of the blocks this is a laser cut kit, and it was pieced really well, I'm just going to, in one path, going to select each of the blocks and make it part of the one complete boundary. That way, when I quilt out my first one, and I'm going to do the same design in each little block. So when I do place my first block, then I'm going to, after it's done, I'm going to say overlay, modify, and just move it over to the next block and move it over to the next block, and so on. And the process goes a little bit quicker. Let's get started with that right now. I go into Pattern Quilting, and I'm going to select my boundary. And on this particular one, this is a little bit interesting, because on the left-hand block, and let's see, yeah, the way this is pieced together on my left-hand block, it is part of the edge, the outer edge. So I'm going to come in 1/4 of an inch from that edge to set my left boundary. That way the quilting design that's in the block doesn't get tucked into the binding. So I'm going to come in just about, maybe a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch actually. As I see my basting thread, I'm going to come in, it's probably about 5/16 of an inch for anybody who's really watching. And I'm going to come in and drop my next point right there. And I'll do an intermediate point just so that it captures any kind of wonkiness, if there is any. And I'll stay within that seam. Yep, just like that. One more. Then I'm going to go up and out. And now I'm going to go into my other blocks here. And I basically choose 8 points per block, the 4 corners and then the 4 midpoints. Again, that's just to capture any kind of curvature or waviness in the outer border. I'm not going to be quilting something that's going to necessarily get very close, but I just do it as a matter of practice. And then I'm going to go up and out of the way, and then down to this next block. Now when it draws this boundary when I'm done, it'll look like a crazy boundary, but in V3 the boundaries really are there for our convenience. They're there to help us as the quilter fit the design properly. They're not there for the computer to do any specific sizing to the design. It's here to aid and help us out. Okay, so now I'm just going to come down here and make a point because I have to close out my boundary and I don't want it to look completely strange, just a little bit strange. And I will say done at this point. Let's see what the boundary looks like. Looks okay in the background. I do not want to set an inner boundary shape this time, so I just say no. And I can see where these boundaries are, and it looks pretty good. I can see on there that here is that outermost point up there on the screen in the upper left, that is not a true point. It's this inner point right there. This is the inner point right there. And I can see each of these squares nicely. The design I want to use is in my designers folder, and it is this lemon leafy design. I like that, and it quilts out nicely. It's a very smooth, nice design. So I need to modify it. I'm going to shrink it down to the correct size. And for this first block, that looks about right. Just come in from the edge a little bit, and that looks good for the first one. So I'm going to say done and move to start point. I didn't save the design because the only adjustment I made to it was just the scale. I didn't do any kind of non-proportional scaling to it, so there's no need to save it, and in case something happens or when I advance the next row, I'm just going to pull that design in again and scale it one more time. And for this first block, the scale is going to be just a little bit smaller than the subsequent blocks, which are just a little bit wider than this first one. Now, when you're looking at the quilt when it's all done, no one will even notice that little size difference. All right, so this is just about finished for the first block. Pull up my bobbin thread. And trim. And now, if you look at the screen, I'm going to now overlay, modify, and I'm just going to move that over into the next block. Just move it over carefully like that. And actually that looks really good just the way it is. I'm not going to mess with it. It's proportioned well, looks good. So I'm going to just press done and it'll move to the start point and press go. Okay, another block done. Trim the threads. Overlay. Modify. Pull it over to the next block. That looks good right like that. I might rotate it 1 degree. Nope. I'm going to rotate it back and maybe rotate it just a half a degree. And for those of you, this is kind of an interesting thing. It has nothing to do with QBOT. It has to do with the Android. If you look at my keypad, you see this right here, this decimal point minus and plus. And that can be confusing if you're trying to put in an angle and you want to go negative, but you see the negative sign there, but all it is a period. But if you double tap it, it's a plus. And if you triple tap it, let's see. Oh, well, plus, of course. Of course, plus doesn't show up as a plus sign on your calculator. It's only the negative does. So that was a little bit of a strange thing. I'm triple tapping to see a plus symbol. Well, plus is just never shows up. Okay, so if you double tap, you get the negative sign. And then you can say, you know, negative, and then wait a second or a tenth of a second or so, and then say that. So that little half a degree rotation looks like that fits nicely. I press done and then move to start. Now this works really nicely. This technique works really nicely because I've put down and stabilized the whole quilt. So because I did that background stitching first, these blocks aren't shifting at all when I'm doing this quilting right now. So being able to select those areas, they're really kind of fixed in space. If you were just starting out with a quilt top here with the backing and batting and the top, and you wanted to march down the quilt by selecting all these blocks at one time and then placing the designs in it, your results may vary because as you put that first block down, and depending on the density of stitching of that block, it may shift everything else. And then when you move to the second block, it could be a little bit off. And if you move to the third block, it could be a lot off because you're now putting the quilt top down and it's starting to really move around. This is especially true if you do quilting with high loft battings, because as the batting takes up that thickness, when you start pinching that fabric down, it's got to pull that fabric in from the sides and then go over and tent over that high loft batting. So buyer beware on that, or quilter beware on using this technique. In this particular way, in the way we're doing it, I've got a low loft batting in here, and my top and backing is all been sewn together, and it's very stable because of the background stitching. So just wanted you to be aware of that. So if you have different results, you have an idea of what's actually happening. And while that's quilting out, and just to reiterate with the high loft batting, or if you haven't done background quilting, the other way to go about it is just do one block at a time to nail it down. And it's just a little bit more, it takes a little bit more time because you have to select the boundary each time, but your results will be better. And our philosophy here is it's better to take a little bit more time up front, and then once it's stitched together, it lasts a lifetime and it looks correct for a lifetime. All right, we're just about done with this first row. One last overlay, modify, pull that into the next block. And it looks like I can go back to my original 0 degrees, rotate that back in. That looks pretty perfect to me. I'll say done and move to start point. Okay, so here the first row of these blocks is done. It looks like I've got maybe 3 more rows to go. Let's see, 1, 2, yep, about 3 rows, 3 more rows to go. And I will not bore you with doing all of that all over again. It'll be just like the first row. So what I would like you to do is please enjoy the inner boundary functions that we have with QBOT V3, being able to quilt around things. It should be a very, very positive thing for you when you're quilting around appliques, or doing like I did here, when your quilt top lends itself to knocking out certain parts or certain blocks on the top to do some quilting in those blocks later. Until next time, enjoy all the features of QBOT V3 and happy quilting.